So today I'm going to talk about a special use case of accessibility, one that I consider to be one of the holy grails of modern day accessibility, one of the things that everybody wants but are still kind of difficult to achieve. And sorry for the late start. I was mistaken about the time that my session was, so that's why I'm a bit unprepared, and that's why we're starting a bit later. Can everybody hear me correctly? If so, then we can get going. So basically, what we're talking about today is a solution for accessible images, really, and in particular icons. If you deal with large-scale web projects these days, you'll find that icons are used a lot to convey some kind of status or, as a functional icon-based image or link or control. And you would think, well, images are really easy to make accessible. We have the alt attribute, we have long dash attributes. I guess it's debatable, but we have our rules and guidelines for how to provide proper alt text, and that's basically the end of it. And I find that in real life projects these days, things are just not as simple, and the theory does not always match up with the reality. So here's an example of some basic icons. In this case, we have icons next to a list of links, and each icon actually represents some information. In this case, a certain status for these icons. So this is a task list with to-do items, so to speak, or tasks, and each icon to the left represents a status of that task. So here we have a check mark in a green circle. That means that the task is complete. Here we have a exclamation mark in a red triangle. That means that there's a problem with that task. And there's two little pencil icons next to these two tasks, and that indicates that you can edit them by clicking on that. So these are just some examples, but just to make you understand what kind of images I'm talking about. So the theory again for images, it's the most basic principle of accessibility. Everybody knows about it, or should know about it at least, and we learn the rules for providing proper alt text. But what we'll find in a lot of projects is that people tend to, or developers tend to, kind of strafe away from the traditional HTML image, as it's defined in the HTML spec. And this trend kind of introduces a lot of new problems. So when you talk about icons, there are certain requirements that you need to meet. Obviously, blind and visually impaired users need to have some kind of equivalent text for the image to convey the purpose of that image, status or meaning. And basically that alternative text needs to be conveyed and exposed to assistive technology. Certain users may have low vision or other types of visual impairments, and they may use certain kind of enhancements like Windows high contrast mode, user-defined style sheets, or some people may have style sheets disabled altogether because that's just the way they prefer it. And at the same time, you may have a client or a developer team that's under a lot of strain and pressure to get a project done in a certain way to minimize the performance load of the page or the size of the page, to save bandwidth, and it needs to be a cost-effective solution. So I mentioned Windows high contrast mode before. I'll just explain a little bit more what that is. For those of you who don't know, it's basically an accessibility feature that comes with the Windows operating system. It has been there for a long time. Not everybody knows about it, but it's kind of a forgotten feature in some cases. Like I've seen accessibility audits being done where people just ignore it, and it's kind of this this thing that's around that's sometimes difficult to prepare your content for, but it's still something that people may use, and it's still something that can enhance accessibility. So basically, it's a theme that Windows can apply to change the background and foreground colors to increase the contrast between those colors. So whereas normally you might see your text as black text on a white background, Windows High Contrast Mode may change those colors to be like yellow on black. And this is on an operating system level, but some browsers like Internet Explorer and Firefox will actually inherit the High Contrast Mode theme set by Windows and will actually apply that to the CSS on the pages that the browser loads according to the same color scheme defined by Windows High Contrast Mode. So in this case, the background and foreground colors will be changed. So what used to be black text will be changed to yellow. What used to be a white background will be changed to black, for example. And also, and this is the bigger issue, is that CSS background styles will basically be overridden as well. So, as I said, the background color changes, but also background images are basically removed. And this is basically where one of the biggest issues comes in. Another thing that I mentioned before was user-defined style sheets. These are basically style sheets that an end user can load into their browser to change the presentation of a page in a way that fits more with their needs. So somebody who has difficulty reading small text could define a style sheet where the fonts are much bigger. Somebody who has difficulties seeing certain contrasts may change the foreground colors or border colors or something like that. Somebody who has difficulties seeing lots of complicated layouts on a page can change the style sheet to make all the content appear as one big column. It's basically the user can do anything with the style sheet that they want. If you know CSS, you'll understand that what you can do with a style sheet. All those things you can do in a user-defined style sheet. Now, obviously, most end users will not have the technical know-how about how to do this, but there's certain accessibility tools and companies that bring out such style sheets that users can load. And like Windows High Contrast Mode, a very common thing that those user-defined style sheets can do is to override background colors and also remove background images. So in a way, you're kind of dealing with the same problem that you could be dealing with when trying to support Windows High Contrast Mode. So before I go on, are there any questions about Windows High Contrast Mode or user-defined style sheets, what they are, or any questions that you might have about them? If so, let me know. I just need to figure out a way to see if there's any questions. So guys on the Skype, if there's any way for me to see if there's questions, let me know. If there's a questions panel. All right. Yeah, thanks, Carl. Just ping me. I'll see the pop-up comment. All right. So switch back to my presentation. So a bit more about icons. We all know the theory. HTML images should be used to convey images that have some kind of meaning. So anything that is useful information that provides a status or some kind of purpose needs to be implemented using an HTML image or as plain text. Where CSS background images were supposed to be used only for decorative images, things that could easily be stripped out without the content losing its meaning. So anything that's redundant, anything that's purely for decoration, as we know, that's what CSS is supposed to be for. The CSS presentation layer is not supposed to convey any meaningful information to the user. And one of the reasons for that is basically what I just described. People may want to disable their CSS style sheets because it fits their needs. People may want to override their style sheets in a way that fits their needs more. So that's the theory behind it. We use HTML images for meaning and semantic information, and use CSS background images for meaningless decorative content. But in reality, HTML images are just not that popular, and it seems they're kind of losing ground in some ways. If you look at some of the more popular like UI libraries like jQuery UI or EXT.js, they have a lot of them use CSS background images to convey meaningful icons. The problem with HTML images is that they tend to be slow to load. They're more difficult to maintain than CSS-based solutions, where you can basically group all icons together in a big sprite, and then that sprite image has to be downloaded once from the server. You don't need multiple round trips for each individual image, and it just speeds up the page a lot. Additionally, CSS-based background images are just easier to maintain because you don't need to store the file path to each individual image, depending on where the page currently is. And in general, CSS is just a bit faster and easier to manage. That's the bottom line. So I've been working with a particular client over the last year who was dealing with this issue where we had, it was a very big project, and the team there was very opposed to using HTML images. So we started off by telling them, well, you have these CSS sprites, and that's not acceptable because they need to be HTML images, and you need to provide alt text and such. And they were very resistant to doing that because it was a large-scale project, and they were using a lot of third-party content that was already using background images. So we started looking for different solutions that can satisfy both, the accessibility desires and, the desires from the team. Because I always feel that an accessibility solution needs to be practical as well. So it's very, it's easy to get on your soapbox and say, well, this is not the way to do it, and it needs to be accessible, so it needs to be done this and this way. But if that way is just very, very difficult to maintain in a large-scale project, and it's not really feasible for teams to implement, then I don't think it's a good solution. So we started looking for different options. So here's just some examples of the issues that can occur when you use HTML images. So even when you do follow the accessibility guidelines, so to speak, and you use an HTML image, there are still certain problems. Here I have a screenshot, and I can actually switch to my virtual machine here and turn Windows High Contrast Mode on. Refresh the page. You can see here that these icons that were kind of dark purple in the beginning, even the HTML images, and they support high contrast mode in the sense that they are not removed. You can see that the images are kind of dark. So imagine if those images had been black, you wouldn't have been able to see them at all. And that's kind of the issue with HTML images that I have, is that even though if you were able to convince your team to use them, the image doesn't actually change based on what high contrast mode theme you use. So for example, if we were to switch to a dark on light high contrast theme, it's fine. But the moment that you switch to a light on dark theme, it's not so good. Now, this is a lot better than what was happening when we were using CSS background images, because there the image just completely disappears, and that's because high contrast mode strips those images out. So this is kind of the original use case. This is the use case that we initially told people to use, and then they promptly pointed out that a lot of these images still weren't very visible in high contrast mode. So even the solution that we recommended wasn't that great for high contrast mode. And we actually did try out a few solutions that could give the benefits of a CSS approach, a CSS-based approach, which, as I said before, CSS is easier to manage than HTML images, but in a way that survives high contrast mode. And this page basically shows those solutions. So the group on the left here is single H, just as traditionally we would recommend. This list here is actually using sprite images. I'll just show you what a sprite image is, by the way. And I'll turn high contrast mode off. This is an example of a sprite image. So what we've done here is each of these images basically loads the sprite as an image source, and it then clips the image to only show the particular icon that you're interested in. So each of these images is basically the entire sprite. It's clipped in such a way that you can only see a small section of it. So it's kind of similar to what sprites do in when CSS backgrounds are used, but the advantage is that they are still HTML images, and they survive high contrast mode. So the problem with that is, as I said before, even in high contrast mode, you are not guaranteed to end up with an image that is properly visible, and that's why I don't think it's that good of a solution. Another issue is that if you were to turn off your CSS, and I know that a lot of people kind of feel that these days that won't be a requirement anymore, but I still think it does. Like, I think your page should work when your style sheets are completely disabled. But if I were to turn this off, you can see that the clipping technique that I was using to hide the rest of the icons in the sprite is now removed. So for every icon that we were using, you get to see the entire clip or the entire sprite. And there's no way to know anymore now which icon we were actually trying to show. And that's a problem. So that's two reasons why the using the HTML image-based clipping method it still isn't that great. Another solution that people will sometimes use to get around the high contrast mode problem is to use a column before pseudo selector in CSS. If you use that technique to insert a background image before some content, that will actually survive high contrast mode as well. As you can see, the image is still visible. Yeah, it's still rendered. So that's a way to get around high contrast mode. And the last technique that we tried out was to use list bullet images. So we have a regular icon, but we use we use those list bullets basically. So as you can see, they all work. They all get around my images are disappearing in high contrast mode problem, but they may not be fully visible depending on what high contrast mode theme you're using. So none of these solutions were that ideal to me, although we did get around the problem of dealing with images surviving high contrast mode in a way that is still managed through CSS. So, I mean, you might wonder, why are we doing these things? The goal was to have a solution that could be fully managed. So all these icons are actually defined in style sheets. They're as easy to manage as background images. and you know, you can just change a class somewhere and have change what the images look like. You don't have to actually change the source path of individual HTML images. And for those of you who are wondering about the regular images, obviously have alt text defined as you know we used to, and all these HTML-based solutions have some hidden text provided. Let me see if I actually put that in here. So you see the hidden text here becomes visible when it turns styles off. So it says completed, problem, pending, pending. That was actually text that is not applied to an alt attribute, but just as text that we hide off with CSS off screen. Let's see if I can show that. See, we have a hidden text class, and that basically hides the text in such a way that it's still visible to screen readers, but not visually. So I hope that I explained a little bit about why simply getting your icons implemented in such a way that survives high contrast mode is not necessarily the best solution, because you're still going to run into this problem. So you're going to run into a problem of your icons possibly not being visible depending on the high contrast theme that the user chooses. Or if you're using the sprite solution, you may end up with a situation where if somebody turns off the style sheets, you're going to see the entire sprite for each icon. Any questions about that? All right, if not, we'll go on. So I've talked before about, any questions? No. I talked before about fallback text or alt text, and I showed you the technique that I tend to use for hiding text off screen, and that's where issue 2 comes in. If you look at high contrast mode, as I said before, it will remove background colors and remove background images. For regular images, that's not so much of a problem, because will actually, when images are not supported, will just show the alt text. And in the case of high contrast mode, you know, the image is still visible, so there's no need for the alt text. But when you're using CSS background images, whatever technique you're using to provide alternative text will still be invisible when high contrast mode is on. So that approach that I showed you before, this hidden text that I've provided here, it would become visible if it were to turn off the styles altogether. But if it's just high contrast mode that's on, you're gonna get the worst of both worlds, because the icon is gone and the alternative text is still hidden. So that alternative text approach, you know, of hiding text off screen works for screen reader users, because they obviously get the alternative text as an accessible name for the image as a fallback text, and it works for people who disable their style sheets altogether, because for them the text becomes visible. But it doesn't work for Windows high contrast mode, and it doesn't work for people who have user-defined style sheets that strip out background images, because the image will be removed, but the fallback text will not make it visible. So you kind of got the worst of both worlds. The image is invisible, and there's no text to fall back on. In this slide, it's just the explanation of the fallback text. And oh yeah, another thing that I mentioned before, you can disable images in user as well. And in that case, most browsers will show the alternative text instead of the image. But if you are using background images with hidden text, then obviously that's still not going to work. So we started looking for better solutions after we've discovered those things. And the first thing that I came up with was a high contrast mode detection script. And some of you will be familiar with that concept because there's a lot of other versions of such a script. For example, there is Dojo actually uses a high contrast mode detection script, the Dojo library. And it's just a way to detect whether high contrast mode is on or not at the moment. So I'll show you what that script looks like for those of you who are interested in it. It's basically something that adds to jQuery object, for those of you who know jQuery. And it does a bunch of checks. It creates a little hidden div element when the page loads, and then it applies some styles to that div element, like a background color and a background image. And then when the page is loaded, it will check if those properties are still there or if they have been changed in the meantime. And if they have been changed, that's a good indication that, that high contrast mode or a custom style sheet or something like that is currently running that is stripping out background images. So in this case, it comes back with a Boolean flag of the jQuery.support.background images, and it will say either true or false, depending on whether high contrast mode is currently on. So we can actually try that out here. It says background images currently results in false, and then there's another flag that we check is high contrast mode. That's currently set to true. If I were to turn off high contrast mode and refresh the page, it should say the option. So it does support high contrast background images now, and high contrast mode is off. So you can use that information to load things differently. For example, one thing that the script does is when high contrast mode is detected, it will actually add a class name to the root HTML elements. In this case, it's UI-helper-high contrast. And you can use that class name to change your CSS slightly. So remember the problem that I was just describing of the hidden text disappearing when high mode is on. So again, that hidden text is here. When high contrast mode is on, the image is going to disappear. But the problem was that the fallback text would still be hidden. So this page, this is a different use case, actually uses the high contrast mode detection script that I made to unhide that hidden text when high contrast mode is on. So when I refresh this page, it's going to run the script, and for more robustness, it takes about 2 seconds for it to properly do the check to be sure that it's properly detected. So when I reload the page, you're going to see the hidden text become visible. See, there you go. So it now actually shows the fallback text in the place where the icon used to be. Now, of course, this is not as nice as looking at an icon, and I understand that it's not the most ideal solution, but it is a solution that gets around this problem. So that's why, if you're in a situation where developers are insistent on using background images and they're willing to put in hidden text, this is a way that you can actually make that hidden text visible by detecting high contrast mode and then unhiding the hidden text. So looking at the style here, you can actually see that I added a selector in my CSS that uses that UI helper high contrast class name on the HTML root element, and then it basically overrides the styles that were used for hiding that span to begin with. So where it used to be clipped and positioned absolutely and everything, it undoes all of that with a more specific selector. And that way you can kind of automate this whole approach. All you need to do is load that script and set the styles in your style sheet, and it will automatically unhide your hidden text in a situation where your icons will be removed otherwise. If there's any questions about that, I know it's a lot of information, but let me know. Or if you have any questions afterwards, you can let me know as well. So that was the first solution, a high contrast mode detection script that can be used to get around that problem of icons disappearing and hidden text not becoming visible. I still didn't feel that the high contrast mode detection script was the best solution, as I said before. For one part of that was that I feel it's kind of ugly to have to look at just plain text where there easily could be icons. Just because somebody is using a custom-defined style sheet or high contrast mode doesn't mean that they can't look at images. There's no reason why these people would have to look at these ugly text versions of things. So while the high contrast mode detection script worked, I wanted to get a solution that worked for in a more nice way, or a more pretty way, so to speak. So looking around, I saw that one thing that has become quite popular over the last few years is font-based icons, or icon fonts. Some of you will know what font icons are, and I'll give a demonstration in a moment. But basically, a font-based icon is a font set, just like you can have, like a font set like Arial or sans serif, or, well, that's not really a font family, but you know what I mean, or Times New Roman. You can actually create a custom font set where instead of letters you have icons in the font definition. And the advantage of this is that even though they look like icons, they're basically text. They're basically rendered as actual letters, like other letters would. They're vector-based, so they can be resized and change color through CSS really easily, which is something that you can do with regular images. And you can actually create your own font sets through sites like iComoon. I'll quickly show it here. So you see all these icons, which look quite nice, but these are actually font characters. So if you were to increase the page size, they would increase as text would do. And the best part of that is, because they're text, they will actually inherit high contrast mode as well. One disadvantage of these icons, by the way, is that because they are text, they can only be monochrome in color. So you can't have multiple colors. They all have to be the same colors, which is why this wouldn't work for more complicated images. But as I said, I find that in a lot of projects, the majority of the images used is through some kind of icon set. So I think it's a good solution. I'll show you the page here, how that works. This is a page with font icons, so they look similar. But when I run high contrast mode, it actually inherits the high contrast theme. In this case, they're blue, by the way, because they're part of a link. So that's why they use the color that has been set in the browser for links at the moment. So if I change that color to something else, you can see that even though they're icons, it inherits high contrast mode perfectly. And that's really what I wanted. I wanted not just that the solution was able to survive high contrast mode in the sense that the information is still being shown, as I did with the hidden text, but I wanted the icon to actually work in high contrast mode in the sense that whoever is using high contrast mode can still see the icon the way it was intended, but in the proper colors defined by the user's color scheme. So for me, that was ideal. The problem with the solution, because these characters or these font sets are defined as a font family in the CSS style sheets, they can easily be overridden. And I'll show you how that can happen. Some user-defined style sheets may like to define their own font families. Let's see. I have a custom style sheet here. So for example, here, this is an example of a style sheet that the user might use. Styles for form control, styles for links, and general font styles, where the font size is changed. But more importantly, also the font family is set to something. And if a user-defined style sheet uses the important keyword, it means that it will override anything that the author could change in their style sheet. So in this case, the user may say, well, I don't know what sites I'm going to visit, but I want all characters on all sites to be a sans serif font. And because they use the important keyword, all the text on your web page is going to have this as a font family now, including these icons where we use font icons to, where we use font icons to convey these icons. So if I were to load this custom style sheet, you can see that all the icons break. So the style sheet is applied, all the colors change, the text size changes, the font family changes, which is fine for regular text because these letters are still letters, so they can still be rendered in the sans serif font. But because these weren't really letters, they were just different character codes that don't really mean anything, which is not available in the sans serif font. And even if it was available in the sans serif font, then it wouldn't look like the icon that we were hoping it would look like. So this is a big problem. The icons look nice. They scale well. They color well. But the moment that you turn on a custom style sheet, they break. And that's why this solution still wasn't the best. And that was a big problem when we got really excited about using font icons. We ran into this problem when somebody mentioned, hey, but what about user-defined style sheets? And then I thought, oh yeah, I guess we were so excited that we didn't really think about that. So there's a few things you can do to get around this problem. Again, it's not perfect. It's a workaround, and I've kind of come to the belief that there just is no perfect solution for this problem in the way that standards currently are. And maybe things like SVG can improve things to properly inherit high contrast mode and things like that, and that could solve it. But at the moment, I think whatever solution you apply, there's going to be some kind of snag that makes it less than perfect. These are the solutions that we come up with for the problem that in user-defined style sheets, your font icons may break. The first thing we did was, because the project that we were doing this on was a very large project with a very broad public user base, and people could contact the organization with complaints. And we actually provided a snippet that people could use if they were to call up and complain about this problem. We provided a snippet that this organization could hand out to the user and say, well, if you add this to your style sheet, then it will fix the problem. So a lot of you will agree that that's not an acceptable solution, but since we were very close to getting live with that project, that was a way for us to deal with it. But of course, you can't expect users to do that and to install that snippet. So the other solution is to actually use the high contrast mode detection script that I was describing before. And what I did was I modified the script to also do a check for custom style sheets or for custom fonts. So I added a check that checks if custom fonts are currently allowed or not, or if they're overridden by the user. And if they are, then you could do the same thing that we were doing before, which is unhiding that hidden text that is provided to provide fallback text for the icon, so that whenever the icon breaks, you could just say, well, instead of that icon, I want to show this. I want to show the hidden text. And then you can add another style that hides this ugly broken icon symbol. So that's one solution. In that case, you would need to use both font icons and this mode detection script, and the result will be that you would see the hidden text appear as it was shown on this page. And the other solution is to use a special font set that Adobe created. Let's see, yeah, invisible font. So Adobe actually created a font family that is also a custom font set, but all the characters are basically rendered as invisible. So the characters are characters that you can't actually see. So what happens here is we have the font icons. They break when a user-defined style sheet overrides the font family. And we have a hidden class that uses this Adobe font set. It's called Adobe Blank, by the way. And the interesting thing is because you're using a custom font for the hidden text, that font will break as well. So let me just show you from the start, maybe that will make more sense. So here, this is the page normal. We have icons that look fine, and then we have the alternative text for the icon, which you can't see because it's not hidden through CSS. We don't use any hiding techniques, but all we do is set this font family, and it will render as invisible text. See, when I remove the font definition, it will actually toggle the visibility of that text. So it's not hidden off screen per se, it's just that it's rendered as text that you can see. When the custom style sheet loads, any custom font will break because of the override style that we created in the style sheet, including that hidden text font set that we were using becomes visible because this is now rendered as a regular serif font. So it's kind of a fallback mechanism that makes use of what was causing a problem before, which is that the custom font sets break. In this case, it's good that they break because it's kind of a fail-safe mechanism. The moment that custom fonts break, the fallback text will break as well and it will become visible. So again, it's not perfect. It still looks a bit ugly, and you still got these icons here. Again, you can hide those with a high contrast mode detection script, or in this case, user-defined style sheet detection script. But at least the information is still there. Nothing is lost. It just looks a bit uglier. But this is kind of the end of my story. This is the solution that I came up with that covers most bases. It works in high contrast mode. It's a nice icon set that survives. I mean, these icons aren't that pretty because I made them up myself, but you can have really nice icons. You can scale them, you can color them. They work in high contrast mode. You can provide alternative text through through the Adobe blank font set, and they work in custom user style sheets. And of course, they work in when CSS is disabled altogether. So it's kind of the end of my story. I understand that using CSS for icons is a bad thing, and we shouldn't be doing it. And what all the things I just described explain why they're bad things and why we shouldn't be doing them. But if you're dealing in a real life situation, a complicated project where using basic HTML images just isn't that feasible, this is a recommendation. This is an approach that has worked well for me, where you can cover most bases. High contrast mode, user-defined style sheet, CSS off, visually impaired users will all get the information, and the icons will still look nice enough to be acceptable for your development team and designers. And it's all CSS based, so it's easy to manage. You don't need to hard code image paths and things like that. So let's look at the time. About 5 minutes for questions. I think I had a few more slides, but these are things that I've already demonstrated. So with that, I guess all we have is time for questions. So if there's any questions, let me know, or any feedback. Maybe I can quickly try to see why I can't hear anything. Oh, I hear something now. Yeah, I can. A lot of static though.
Can you hear me now? Excellent. Yeah, this microphone has static. The other one couldn't hear me well. So yeah, Terrell Thompson said that his question in the chat was, can the high contrast mode detection script detect details about the user's high contrast mode?
It's not that specific, but what it does do is what I'll show you now. I mean, we could easily change it to do very specific, getting the color value and things like that. But what we did do is this. So we got the support.highContrastMode flag, so that's set to true. But then we also have the light and dark flag, which can either be true or false. So currently it's true because it's a light and dark scheme. If I change to the opposite, to a dark and light scheme, it's going to be false. And the reason why that's useful is that if you were to, if you wanted to swap your HTML-based images, which is a solution that I didn't really talk about, but you can actually use the script to replace your HTML images with high contrast versions. You can use this flag to determine whether the image should be a light and dark image or a dark and light image. And yeah, so that's what I found most useful to do. We didn't put in any support for knowing which exact colors they're being using, but we could easily do that. So.
Yeah, and actually, you know, for those who are interested, I turned Hans's work into a function that I put into JS Fiddle that I just posted into the chat room. And this is all Hans's, but all I did was I turned it into a JavaScript function that returns a Boolean value. And certainly Hans himself probably has some other code examples out there. But yeah, I think this is a really big deal that a lot of people often fail to take into consideration. Does anybody else have any questions for Hans? Question from Dennis, I assume Dennis Lembry. And his question was, are you familiar with the Filament Group's article that recommended its open source?
Yeah, actually, I did come across that.
And, so can you comment?
When I was looking at this, and yeah, I think that's a good approach what they did as well. I mean, checking for font support is not that complicated. So what I did in the high contrast mode detection script, which for those of you who didn't realize, it does a lot more than just detecting high contrast mode at this point, but I still call it that. But yeah, it's relatively easy to implement, and anybody who does that probably does a good thing. So I think what Filament Group did was a good thing.
Now, Sarah Horton has a question, and her question was, Hans, is there any discussion of re-examining high contrast mode disabling of CSS images, or does that just go against the whole?
Yeah, I think it should be discussed again. I think it's all a bit outdated, and I think CSS has grown out to be something much more than just a presentation layer, and why not extend it a little bit to on a very specific guidance, of course, and restrictions of what can be done and what can't be done. I think using HTML images as they're defined at the moment is just a bit outdated at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, my idea here is, you can almost understand the reasoning behind Windows's approach, right? Because CSS is presentation and markup is content. But like you said, now we're venturing into areas where some of these techniques can be really useful. And sprites are a great example. Companies that send out a ton of bandwidth, they send out a ton of information over the wire, the kind of information over the wire that we really can't even comprehend if we're not working in those environments. These guys save a lot of money by using sprites and stuff like that. I mean, there's a lot to be saved versus using plain old traditional image tags. And so this is a real challenge for these guys because some of them want to remain accessible, but they have to deal with
I think
the realities, which is
it's not so much that companies don't want to do the right thing. It's just that at the moment there just isn't really a right thing that works perfectly in a way that is easy to understand for people. And like if you look at all the things that I just described, none of them I would say are super elegant or just something that an average developer would grasp and understand why he would have to do it that way. And you can't really expect the average company or development team to know all this stuff and do all this stuff. I mean, we always say that people need to be aware and need to understand accessibility principles, and that's true. But in this case, it's going a bit beyond. Like it's so many hacks and workarounds that we have to apply that it's understandable that they don't fully grasp this, and that's because the technology and the solutions here, like Windows High Contrast Mode, is just so old and it's been around for so long and it hasn't really changed. Those paradigms could be changed into something more up to date with today's technology and approaches to web design.